Hey folks, this is Doug Dalma. Welcome to my channel, or welcome back. It's been a bit since I have recorded anything. I last recorded some sermons during the first few weeks of coronavirus shutdowns back in 2020, which fortunately did not last too long at our church, and we are back. Well, I thought that I would read to you my book, The Biography of Gordon Clark. I got inspired recently from some of my friends' online work on YouTube, especially Patrick Hines. I recommend his Pulpit Supplemental with Bridwell Heights. That's quite excellent. And I was thinking, I wish I could speak as well as he did, but I prefer the medium of writing, so I typically write articles and then occasionally in a book. And I do hope, sort of long-term goal, I do really hope to write a book on Dr. Clark's philosophy, which I've been working on for some years, but is just in scattered notes still, and has proven to be much more difficult than writing a biography. Well, what I think I'm going to do is read the biography of Dr. Clark about an hour here at a time, and I will stop and make comments if there's relevant or interesting things to say, whether if it's something new that I've learned about Dr. Clark or something that's going on in contemporary Presbyteriana or anything else in the world relevant to this topic. So trying to think if there's anything else I want to say. Obviously, I think Dr. Clark is a pretty fascinating character, and thus I spent so many years working on his biography. So I have my personal copy here of the Presbyterian Philosopher. Everything's backwards in a camera here. There you go. And I always get a kick out of this. I have Dr. Clark's daughter's notes here. She read a copy of my book. Very favorable. The family was very appreciative. One of his daughters likes, well, both of them, but one of them in particular likes grammar, and she gave me a list of corrections. And there definitely are errors in the book. They are my fault, as a lot of them crept in after the editing process, and I would come back just before printing with a few more additions, and then my additions had errors in them. But let's see, I'm going to skip for now the introduction and the preface. I'll just mention here some of the cool people that endorsed the book. I was very excited to speak with each of these people, with Jay Adams, Ken Talbot, Claire Davis, David Engelsma, William Barker, Erwin Lutzer, Frank Walker, Dominic Aquila, Andrew Zeller, and John Frame, each of whom read the book prior to publication and gave me comments and endorsed the book. Oh, there's a note. To Henry. The book is listed as To Henry, and I think the Clarks quite like this, as the very last word in the entire book here is Zephy, the dog, Dr. Clark's dog, Zephaniah. And the book starts here with my former dog, my beloved Bernese mountain dog, sadly passed while I was at seminary, whose name was Henry. And kind of an homage to Dr. Clark as well, with his love of dogs. I don't know if I mentioned in the biography that it said somewhere that he knew his neighbors' dogs' names better than his neighbors. I might fall into that same situation. So let's start then with chapter 1 of the Presbyterian Philosopher, and we'll see how long this takes, and whether we can go for a full hour or finish the chapter sooner than that. Chapter 1, the Presbyterian Heritage of Gordon Clark. I put a little note here at the beginning. It says, Clark, an English surname ultimately derived from the Latin clericus, meaning scribe, secretary, or a scholar within a religious order, referring to someone educated. I found that to be interesting because it's so fitting for who Dr. Clark is. It's as if his surname was chosen intentionally. So, Gordon Haddon Clark, 1902 to 1985, was born into the Christian tradition of old school Presbyterianism, known for requiring ministers to subscribe to the system of Protestant Christian doctrine contained in the Westminster Confession of Faith, 1646. Old school Presbyterianism shaped Clark's understanding of the world. In his career as a theologian and a Christian philosopher, Clark defended the Confession and sought to keep his own philosophical views in line with its teachings. In fact, it could be said that he was a philosopher of the Westminster Confession, truly a Presbyterian philosopher. Historical circumstances initially set Clark on this course. In fact, he was the son of a Presbyterian minister, who in turn was the son of a Presbyterian minister. For 2 generations, then, starting with his paternal grandfather, James Armstrong Clark, 1831 to 1894, Presbyterian ministry was of central importance to the family. While Gordon Clark never met his grandfather, who died before Gordon was born, he did travel as a child with his parents to visit relatives in western Pennsylvania, where the family had lived since shortly after James arrived from Scotland in 1854. Digging into the Clark family line, we can see how he inherited the Christian doctrines that shaped the core of his thought. Basic knowledge of his grandfather, James Clark, survives in a 15-page handwritten autobiography written sometime in the late 19th century. Because the content of the autobiography ends abruptly in 1858, and other sources on his life are scant, we can only piece together the basic contours of James's life. What we do know shows that he was deeply committed to the Presbyterian faith. James was born December 4th, 1831, to William Baldwin Clark, 1791 to 1858, and Jean Armstrong, 1796 to sometime in the 19th century. To William, I'm skipping a line back, in Hawick, Scotland, and baptized at Hawick's East Bank Associate Church. The idea here in this chapter is that I'm trying to show that Dr. Clark is not this newcomer into Presbyterian tradition and inventing ideas on his own, but really comes through this path of Scottish and American Presbyterians. So you can see just how in depth ingrained it is in his family. Now, that 15-page handwritten autobiography I mentioned of Dr. Clark's grandfather, James Armstrong Clark, is in the possession of the family, and it's sort of a fragile, well, not too fragile, but relatively fragile document, folded in thirds, and still in decent shape, but difficult to read. That kind of a hard to read handwriting from the period. So I'll continue. As a child, and this is talking about James, Dr. Clark's grandfather, as a child, he was affected by the disruption of 1843, which fractured the established Church of Scotland. In this seminal event in Presbyterian history, some 450 ministers of the church's total of 1,200 ministers broke away and formed the Free Church of Scotland. The secession came as a response to the state's encroachment upon the spiritual affairs of the church. Although James was only 12 years of age at the time of the disruption, he recalled in his autobiography that at that time he had religious impressions and dispositions, and took sides against the establishment. By the time he was 14 years of age, he had taken sides with the Calvinist docts and made a fair offer in argument on the 5 points of Calvinism. Soon after the disruption, James's parents chose to join a Free Church congregation, and James's father, William, was elected as an elder. A few years later, James left home to attend the Free Church Normal College in Edinburgh. Following his graduation, he became a teacher at the Free Church Normal School in Yarrow, Scotland, 1851 to 1854. You can, if it hasn't bored you already, you realize that this is just historical information at first, and whenever you work on someone's life and look back in their genealogy, you'll find this type of information rather scant, but there is some there. And so this is sort of just material that we need to get through, really, to get into Dr. Clark's story. And so I say, I promise the more interesting stuff is yet ahead. But hopefully, for some of the historical types, this is itself interesting. Historical knowledge of Presbyterianism came to Gordon Clark through family stories of the church in Scotland and in the United States. In fact, for generations, Clark family history was largely tied up with the history of the church. Although Gordon Clark's grandfather, James, arrived on American shores in 1854, James's brother Will had preceded him by a few years. Will found in the United States a very large field of usefulness for the ministry. Inspired by the potential for ministry in the U.S., James resigned his teaching position in Scotland and followed his brother's path across the ocean. On April 24, 1854, just weeks prior to leaving Scotland, James married Margaret Scott, 1834 to 1881, satisfying his mother's wish that he would not emigrate alone. Once in the United States, he taught bookkeeping and was the principal of a business college, which he owned and operated in Philadelphia for a year, before selling its assets and returning to college as a student. He enrolled first at Franklin College in Ohio, but left in 1855 to attend Allegheny Seminary, where he studied theology, graduating in 1858. Upon his arrival in the U.S., James joined the Associate Presbyterian Church, an ethnically Scottish denomination with roots reaching back over a century in the United States. When, in 1858, this church merged with other Scottish Seceder and Covenanter churches in America to form the United Presbyterian Church of North America, the UPCNA, James, who had been licensed to preach in the Associate Presbyterian Church in 1857, joined the new body in short order and was ordained in 1859. He preached for the remainder of his life in the UPCNA at a number of churches in Butler County, Pennsylvania. And in fact, somewhere on my blog, I actually have some pictures of his gravesite. Some years after I wrote this, I was passing through that area of western Pennsylvania and was able to stop at a Presbyterian church graveyard next to the church. And it was not hard to find his gravesite there. After the death of his first wife, Margaret Scott, in 1881, James married Frances N. Wilson in 1884. In total, he had 2 daughters and 7 sons. So again, this is Dr. Clark's grandfather. Now we're getting to his father. Among the children born to James Armstrong Clark and his first wife, Margaret Scott, was the father of Gordon Clark, David Scott Clark, 1859 to 1939. Although few records remain providing details of David's early life, it is possible to provide a basic outline of his academic track. According to United Presbyterian Church records, David graduated in 1884 from Mount Union College in Ohio, received an MA from the same college in 1886, and was awarded an honorary DD in 1908. He also studied at Princeton Theological Seminary, 1883 to 1885, as well as the Free Church College in Edinburgh, 1885 to 1886, before returning to Princeton, where he graduated in 1887 with a Master of Divinity degree. David's learning would prove influential in Gordon Clark's upbringing. David equipped his son with a set of competencies that other young students would not learn until seminary, including knowledge of Presbyterian history, church doctrine, and the nature of recent events in the church. From his father, Gordon learned about the influence of Princeton Theological Seminary on the American religious scene. David based his views on first-hand experience. As a student at Princeton in the 1880s, he witnessed the institution at the peak of its historical influence. In the first 100 years of the seminary, 1812 to 1912, it had graduated nearly 6,000 ministers, 1,000 more than any other seminary in America, and these students spread Princetonian ideas far and wide. Leading the seminary at the time of David's attendance were the prominent theologians A. A. Hodge, 1823 to 1886, and B. B. Warfield, 1851 to 1921. And here is I inserted my attempt at humor, I call them these two improbably named men, AA and BB, AA Hodge and BB Warfield. And I think Dr. Clark would appreciate that. One of the stories that's told in one of his, in some place I can't remember anymore, is that he would hold up a sign or have students hold up a sign that said joke whenever his lectures were getting too boring. They would hold up that sign and he would take a break and tell a joke, which you have to be prepared for such a thing as that. These two improbably named men stood firm on the doctrine of the Bible's inerrancy and authority, an essential element of the seminary's conservative theology that came to be known as Princeton theology. Alongside Princeton theology, the seminary was also a stronghold for Old School Presbyterianism. The term Old School Presbyterianism is traced back to 1837, when a schism tore the Presbyterian Church of the United States into two camps. Known as the Old School, New School controversy, the resulting schism separated the two schools of thought from 1837 to 1865. I think there's more to it. I'm actually sitting in my church building where we have built on a fellowship hall that was built in 1871. And so I forget exactly how all the splits and mergers happened in Presbyterian history, but in 1871, I think that was more of a finalization of that Old School, New School reunion. And that's when we dedicated that apparently to that cause. And there was a minister here at this church for 28 years during that period, some of whose sermons I have here. In fact, I think I've typed up a few of them and posted them on my blog if you're interested in that. His name was Henry Frost Wadsworth. Don't know too much about him, but do have some of his sermons. All right, continuing on. In this episode, as throughout much of Presbyterian history, the Church faced a difficult question regarding the extent to which subscription to the Westminster Confession of Faith, that is, a profession of belief in and promise to teach and defend its doctrines, should be required of ministers. This topic of subscription becomes this recurring theme in American Presbyterian history. So often it comes back to that. On the previous page here, I mentioned biblical inerrancy, but also we have this idea of confession to the subscription, or subscription to the confession. And this is also important as conservative churches have ministers subscribe to the confession. And you'll see a weakening of that as you go from the right to the left. So in the Presbyterian scene today in America, the denomination that I'm in is one of a few that has a strong subscription where ministers agree to the confession. And as you go from here, the Bible Presbyterian Church, to the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, then the Presbyterian Church in America, and then the Evangelical Presbyterian Church and the Presbyterian Church USA, you'll see a increasing decrease. You'll see a decreasing interest in the confession and willingness to subscribe to it. And correspondingly, you'll see more and more problems develop in doctrine because of the weakening of that standard and the weakening of connection to our historical roots. And really, Dr. Clark thought, and as I do as well, that the Westminster Confession of Faith, though not perfect, is certainly a grand document, one of the greatest summaries of the Christian faith that we have. So we don't want to overlook it, as ministers have. I knew a PCUSA minister in North Carolina who had some sort of problem, and I told him about the answer being in the confession, and he didn't have a copy, probably hadn't seen it. He was in his 80s at the time. He's deceased now. And I remember him saying, well, I don't have a copy of the Westminster Confession. So he didn't even know the proper title of it. You can see how far the PCUSA has gone, especially since 1967 when they did away with the confession and um, created a book of confessions. It was really a smokescreen and got rid of doctrine almost entirely. And Dr. Clark argues in one of his letters that it is there that the PCUSA really ceased to be a church because they no longer believe in anything. And so you can't come after a minister. You can't bring a trial up against someone if there's no standard against which to judge them. So yes, the confessional subscription is important, and I recommend. There's a lecture I gave once at Reedy River Presbyterian Church on confessional subscription called something like "Low, High, and In Between," and the importance of the confession. Okay, I'll continue on here. I may have skipped a line. The theologians of the New School embraced revivalism and modified a number of the historical Calvinistic doctrines. The Old School theologians, on the other hand, were largely suspicious of the New School's views and advocated subscription to the Westminster Confession of Faith. As a check on their perceived deleterious effects, the two schools officially merged in 1865. But factions within the church were still visible decades later. David S. Clark, that's Gordon's father, found his pastorates in Philadelphia, and so Gordon Clark grew up in a city which had long been a hub of Presbyterianism in America. In fact, the very first presbytery, or session of church elders, in the American colonies was formed there in 1706, and the Presbyterian Church in the USA chose to hold its first General Assembly in Philadelphia in 1789. 100 years later, in 1889, David accepted a call to Wissinoming Presbyterian Church, and perhaps a native Philadelphian could give me the correct pronunciation there, just outside of Philadelphia, for his first position as a minister. It was at this church that David Clark met Miss Elizabeth Yates Haddon, 1878 to 1931. In retelling his father's story, Gordon Clark wrote, "One day a girl appeared in church wearing a red hat, and apparently the attraction was so obvious that she never wore it again. They were married in 1895, and I was born in 1902." End quote. In 1894, David took charge of the Memorial Collegiate Chapel, and in 1899 organized a church at the same site on the corner of 19th and York Streets. The congregation, which changed its name to Bethel Presbyterian Church, flourished under David's tenure, so that by 1912 it counted 340 members. I remember speaking with Dr. Clark's son-in-law, Dwight Zeller, about this, and I mentioned that church not being a big church, and I just didn't understand at the time, having grown up in the Lutheran church with large churches, that thinking hundreds of members was fairly normal. But now I understand in the Presbyterian world that really a church of 100 or so is a very large church. It's a very functional church, where many Presbyterian churches across America are smaller than that. I've preached for as few as 4 or 5 people at a church I visited in Tennessee. Preached for about 12 out in California once. And small churches abound. We are blessed here at my rather small church still to have now 30 or more in attendance on most Sundays. And we're praying for that to expand over the years. Okay, continuing here. Shortly after the founding of Bethel Presbyterian Church, Gordon Haddon Clark was born to the Reverend David Scott Clark and his wife Elizabeth Haddon Clark on August 31, 1902. He was their only child. Growing up in the shadow of Bethel Presbyterian Church, Gordon gained from his father the wisdom of years of practical experience as a Presbyterian minister, as well as insight into writing for publication and inspiration for academic work. The elder Clark wrote 3 theological books, including a commentary on the book of Revelation titled The Message from Patmos. That's a post-millennial commentary that David Clark writes, which is interesting because early in Dr. Gordon Clark's career, he says, "Oh, I'm a post-millennialist or a millennialist." He actually says post-millenarian or a millenarian, which seems to be a more archaic use of the term that he was still using there in the 1930s, where you don't really hear that version of it anymore. But as many do know, Dr. Clark, sometime in the 1930s, while working there at Wheaton College, came to believe in the historic premillennial position, and seems to have held that throughout his life, finally writing a chapter about it on eschatology in his systematic theology, which I've typed up, made available on my blog, so you can find that chapter there. Okay, continuing about David Scott Clark. He also penned multiple position pieces for Presbyterian journals. As an instructor in doctrine at the Presbyterian School for Christian Workers, or Tennant College, in Philadelphia from 1917 to 1929, and later as an instructor in philosophy at Eastern University, also in Philadelphia, David Clark kept one foot in the academic world. By all indication, Gordon's respect and admiration for his father was deep, and the ultimate inspiration he gleaned from his father as role model cannot be overestimated. So Dr. Clark's father is both a Presbyterian minister and a scholar. Clark, maybe you can turn that around. Gordon Clark became primarily a scholar, but there were times where he was a minister, sometimes just visiting as a preacher, but through the late 50s and 60s, he was the sole minister of his church, and so while also being a professor of at Butler University. So he kept very busy. All right, we'll continue here. Presbyterianism also ran deep in the Haddon family, Gordon Clark's maternal line. The Haddons came from English Presbyterian stock in the county of Devon, England. Gordon's maternal grandfather, Thomas Deacon Haddon, 1834 to 1914, was not a minister but had mastered biblical Greek in his free time apart from his work as a wool carder. Gordon's uncle, Charles K. Haddon, 1867 to 1935, was also a church-going man, a supporter of prohibition, and for 15 years, 1906 to 1921, the vice president of the Victor Talking Machine Company, a leading manufacturer of phonographs and phonograph records. The company was founded by Charles's close friend Eldridge Johnson and later successfully defended itself in a court case on patent infringement raised by Thomas Edison. Shortly after Charles retired, he traveled around the world twice, first on the RMS Samaria in 1823, then on the RMS Franconia in 1927. After each voyage, Charles published the letters he had written and received while abroad. Charles's wealth not only afforded his world travels, but also made it possible for his father, Gordon Clark's maternal grandfather, Thomas Deacon Haddon, to retire at 60 years of age and devote much of his remaining years to studying the Bible. Gordon Clark embraced his Presbyterian heritage. When he was a child, his father taught him the Westminster Shorter Catechism, a question and answer summary of the basic beliefs of the Presbyterian Church. He also followed his father's interest in theology by reading from the many books in their home library. Local neighborhood children associated Clark so strongly with the church that they gave him the nickname Clerg, a dig at his father's status as a member of the clergy. That's actually mentioned in one of Gordon Clark's own sermons. I believe it's one of the few that is typed up and therefore easily legible. And that's my best understanding of what's going on there when it says Clerg. It's a very strange name. I think maybe it's sort of a twist on Clark to Clerg, but then also clergy. So that seems to be what's going on. Looking back at his Presbyterian heritage later in life, Clark recalled this. Well, I've known about Scottish Presbyterianism from both sides of my family. I guess you call it heritage. So many of us are blindly proud of our heritage without knowing what it is. But in my experience, I think heritage is like a bedtime story of Grandpa's reminiscence. It's really kind of a naive thing, like the Jews remembering the wilderness and the walls of Jericho. It's to give you a respect for courage as well as a feeling of worth as a descendant of Abraham. Now, I'm sure in today's modern climate with wokeism and all of this silly stuff, that's what I call this stuff going on, silliness. And I'm an anti-silliest or sillinessist. And so the wokists would probably say, "Oh, this is terrible to have respect for your genealogy or for your grandparents in this way." It's probably racist. Everything's racist according to them. But I say the good thing about wokeism is that it will one day be gone. We've seen modernism come and go, postmodernism come and go, and now wokeism. And I think that those who say that postmodernism is sort of this preeminent paradigm are mistaken. That is in the past, and we are now in a time of where this new mindset has taken control. Of course, it's never a new mindset. And Clark and others always would make this argument. These errors that you see in thinking almost always have been tried before. Clark sees it especially in the Greeks, but also just in various errors within Christendom. You'll see these things come back. So, of course, many of us know the wokest movements are recapitulations of errors of the past from Marxism, feminism, and various other isms and avenues. So we'll continue here. Incidentally, I think even when I wrote this book, just not that many years ago, wokeism still hardly existed, and I was not aware of it. This is something new and dangerous, not more dangerous, though, than we can handle as Christians and being equipped with the truth of God's truth from the scriptures. So let's continue here. We're at 32 minutes. With the family's income dependent on David's job as a pastor, Clark grew up fairly poor. He noted in a handwritten document of his recollections that there was one time when the church was 9 months in arrears paying his father's salary. He also noted that they did not have electricity in their house until about 1914. It was only after Clark was in college that the family received a great boon when Gordon's wealthy Uncle Charles, Elizabeth Haddon Clark's brother, gave them checks at Christmas. Each Christmas in the late 1920s and early 1930s, Charles gave Clark and his cousins $100 checks. To Clark's mother, he gave checks of $1,000. Charles was also the financial source of Clark's cherished childhood dog, Victor, named for the phonograph company. As Clark grew to adulthood, he deepened his involvement in his father's church by teaching Sunday school lessons, and later was appointed the Sunday school superintendent, a post he held for 10 years. Clark also benefited from the cultural opportunities abounding in the city of Philadelphia. He first professed to be a Christian at a campaign of the popular Presbyterian evangelist preacher and former professional baseball player Billy Sunday, when his tour came through Philadelphia in early 1915. This revelation may come as a surprise to many who knew Clark later in his life, as Clark's own methods of evangelism diverged greatly from those of Billy Sunday. Clark emphasized the intellect, whereas Sunday, following the methods of the Second Great Awakening revivalists, appealed to his audience's emotions. Also in Philadelphia, Clark was fortunate to see a performance of the famed composer John Philip Sousa. Clark himself had an interest in music, for a time taking up the cornet. Clark's public school education was fairly standard, but it also provided him some advantages. He attended the all-boys Northeast High School of Philadelphia. The school, founded in 1890, was originally known as the Northeast Manual Training School, but by the time Clark attended, 1917 to 1920, it had changed its name, removing the manual training. Although the school retained some hands-on courses after the name change, its main focus became the liberal arts and college preparation. In keeping with that focus, Clark studied a number of languages, including French, Latin, and Greek, not biblical or Koine, but Attic Greek, which was commonly taught at secular high schools in that period. With just two exceptions, a deficient in both Latin and freehand drawing in his senior year, his report card shows that he received a fairly even mixture of good, fair, and excellent marks. That seems to have been what they used at that time. It wasn't ABC, but good, fair, excellent, and poor, I think was the bottom one, or something like this. Given the influence of his family, church, and school, Clark developed into a young man knowledgeable in the scriptures and the Presbyterian tradition. By the time he left for college at the University of Pennsylvania, Penn, he had a strong Christian faith, was well read, and was conscious of his Presbyterian identity. In many ways, this made him a prime candidate to be an uncompromising scholar, and elicited opportunities to delve deeper into philosophy, a subject that required the language and logic skills he had already acquired as a youth. At Penn, Clark improved his knowledge of foreign languages, and as a top student in French, he received the, Alliance Française, that's my attempt, medal from the French Language Honorary Society. He also studied Hebrew under James Allen Montgomery, 1866 to 1949, whom Clark thought was one of the best living scholars then working against biblical criticism. About Professor Montgomery, Clark once wrote, "He was one to whose very slender 6'5" we students all looked up." This is another attempt at humor, maybe better than my own. During his undergraduate years, Clark was elected a member of the prestigious Honor Society Phi Beta Kappa, but later admitted in a job application to Wheaton College, a college which frowned upon anything even resembling a secret society, to have attended only one meeting, and even then just to accept an award. In 1924, at the age of 22, he received a bachelor's degree in French, and proceeded to the graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania, where he studied philosophy. Although he was interested in attending Princeton Theological Seminary, like his father before him, Clark believed modernizing trends at the seminary made it an uncongenial place for true Christian study. And so far I've skipped reading footnotes, but this perhaps is one worth reading to prove that point, first to myself and then to those who are listening. I have a quote here it's from Gordon Clark writing to J. Gresham Machen, and that's the correct pronunciation. This was discussed on one of Patrick Hines' videos recently. J. Gresham Machen. And Clark writes to him on 25th of October, 1928. This is from the Westminster Archives. Clark writes, "It was my purpose, when I chose to teach philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania, rather than study theology at your seminary, to defend and promulgate an evangelical faith in Christ. The door has indeed been opened. I do not regret my choice." So it's not so much explicit there, but it seems like Clark is comparing Pennsylvania with Westminster, and telling Machen, who he'd been friends with since at least 1925 or 26, telling Machen he doesn't regret studying at Penn. And I think actually the family connection goes back earlier. I think 1921, there's a letter from Machen to David S. Clark, Gordon's father. Okay. Where are we? Here we go. Clark thrived during his graduate years under the impressive philosophy faculty at the University of Pennsylvania. There were four main professors under whom he studied: Edgar A. Singer, Jr., 1873 to 1955, Isaac Husick, 1876 to 1939, Henry Bradford Smith, 1882 to 1938, and William Romaine Newbold, 1865 to 1926. All four of these men had received their doctorates in philosophy from Penn, and had taken faculty positions at the university, a path Clark would soon follow. Professor Singer was a philosopher of pragmatism and former student at Harvard of the influential American philosopher and psychologist William James, 1842 to 1910. For years after leaving Penn, Clark remained in correspondence with Singer, likely distilling some of these conversations into his own monograph critiquing William James's philosophy. It was also at Penn that Isaac Husick, a noted historian of Jewish philosophers, introduced Clark to Aristotle's De Anima, about which Clark chose to write his dissertation. Clark studied logic at Penn under Henry Bradford Smith, the author of several logic textbooks. Clark was impressed by Smith. He wrote, "I find H.B. Smith's first book in logic very satisfactory." It was, however, William Romaine Newbold, Clark's advisor for his first 2 years, of whom he was most fond. This attraction was likely due in part to their shared Christian convictions within the mostly secular philosophy department and university. That would be an interesting avenue of study, and maybe someone could look into it more, exactly to what extent Newbold was a Christian. I recall Newbold liked to study things of early Christianity, but whether Newbold was particularly active in a church, and which one, I really don't know that. Certainly didn't study him exhaustively, but his papers are at Pennsylvania. Someday maybe could access them in the archives there. So of Newbold, in addition to being a talented academic, Newbold had eccentric study interests, including Gnosticism, hypnosis, telepathy, and cryptography, even attempting to decipher the famed and still to this day undeciphered Voynich manuscript. And if you don't know what the Voynich manuscript is, you really need to look this up. And it's become something of a joke among my good friends, my twin brother Michael and my good friend Minister Charles Roberts. We like to pretend we can read Voynichese, this possibly made up language or possibly lost language that's written in this strange manuscript. And I have a longer footnote here about William Romaine Newbold being one of the prominent people that attempted to decipher this, which is still to this day undeciphered. It's really one of the greatest challenges of cryptography. And I think even if it's not a code, you could still say it's a challenge in cryptography, because the challenge would be to show what language it is, or what language it's similar to, or to prove that it is made up and not a language at all. I haven't studied it myself. It seems like one of those things that is going to be a real time killer. I think many lives have been lost in trying to decipher the Voynich manuscript. Okay, we'll continue. Newbold demonstrated his affection for Clark in giving him a book inscribed, "To Gordon Haddon Clark, in whose mind the mind of William Romaine Newbold took much delight." And that would be just a fascinating conversation to be able to hear what was this William Romaine Newbold and Gordon Haddon Clark talking about in the 1920s. It would have been fascinating. But as we continue here, Newbold's premature death in 1926 affected Clark deeply, both personally and professionally. Clark spoke at Newbold's memorial service. He was the only student given that honor. He later recalled the circumstances in which he was offered a teaching position, upon the death of my beloved superior. In Clark's 1929 doctoral dissertation, Empedocles and Anaxagoras in Aristotle's De Anima, he praised Newbold for being a fountain of inestimable value during my first 2 years of study in Greek philosophy. With all the new intellectual thoughts and challenges at Penn, it was appropriate that Clark begin to test himself also as a teacher. In 1924, as a graduate student, he began teaching undergraduate philosophy courses. In 1926, he inherited a course on the history of the philosophy of Christianity from Dr. Newbold. Clark continued teaching throughout graduate school with just one break to study in Heidelberg, Germany, in the summer of 1927. After the University of Pennsylvania accepted his dissertation, Clark attended the University of Paris, commonly known as the Sorbonne, during the spring and summer of 1930. Just one interesting note, my own grandfather studied at the Sorbonne. Somehow he took some art courses there after World War II, and that's about all I know of it. Okay, continuing. His knowledge of modern and ancient languages allowed him to effectively study in both Germany and France, as he was able to read each country's philosophers in their own languages. He continued to stay conversant in French and German throughout his life, later corresponding with a pen pal in Germany to help retain his German language skills, and also ensuring that his two daughters learned French. He returned to Penn in the fall of 1930 to continue teaching. The philosophy department at Penn inspired Clark to think critically and form his own defense of the Presbyterian faith, but his time there also shaped his life in other lasting ways. During his graduate years at Penn, he met his future wife, Ruth Schmidt, who was also studying at the university. They found they had much in common. They were both native Philadelphians, had both attended public high schools, Clark at the all-boys and Ruth at the all-girls, and were both conversant in French. Remarkably, Gordon's father had baptized Ruth when she was a child. This baptism took place despite Ruth's family membership at a Methodist church. It is unclear why her baptism occurred in the Presbyterian church, other than the family's speculation that it might have been because of David Clark's popularity as a pastor. Two books Gordon gave to Ruth, which are now in the Clark collection in the Clark Library at the Sangre de Cristo Seminary, indicate the blossoming of Gordon and Ruth's relationship. One, dated 1925, was simply given to Ruth, while a second inscription, dated 1927, is much more warmly inscribed to "My darling Ruthie." While at Penn, Ruth earned both a bachelor's, 1928, and a master's degree, 1932, in botany. Gordon and Ruth married in March of 1929 and remained together for 48 years until Ruth's death in 1977. The couple had two children, Lois Antoinette, born 1936, and Nancy Elizabeth, born 1941. I don't know if I mention it somewhere in here, but Dr. Clark often talks about botany, and so you see the reason why. His wife was, by training, a botanist, and so I'm sure there were conversations on the topic. And so in some of Clark's videos, he'll talk about cacti and tomatoes and other items of interest in the world of botany. Okay. Following their wedding, the Clarks went on a honeymoon at a chalet in Dorset, Vermont, owned by Bishop Robert Livingston Rudolph, 1865 to 1930, a professor at the Reformed Episcopal Seminary in Philadelphia and bishop in the Reformed Episcopal Church. Clark was very close to Bishop Rudolph and his son Robert Knight Rudolph, 1906 to 1986, both of whom spent their careers teaching at Reformed Episcopal Seminary. Clark first came to know of Bishop Rudolph when Rudolph bought up nearly the entire stock of Clark's father's theology textbooks. Clark came across the elder Rudolph again at the Philadelphia Philosophical Society and persuaded the bishop, 37 years his senior, to agree to his position as a 5-point Calvinist. Robert K. Rudolph, the bishop's son, enrolled in Clark's undergraduate philosophy courses at Pennsylvania, and as the younger Rudolph was far closer in age to Clark, became and remained a close, lifelong friend. When the University of Pennsylvania reduced Clark's pay as a result of the Great Depression, he utilized his connection with the Rudolphs and taught a few additional courses at the nearby Reformed Episcopal Seminary. While teaching at the University of Pennsylvania, where he remained until 1936, Clark was the founder and then advisor of the university's chapter of the League of Evangelical Students, an early forerunner to institutions like Campus Crusade for Christ, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and Reformed University Fellowship. He wrote articles for their magazine, The Evangelical Student, helped to organize chapters at other colleges, and once was the toastmaster at an evening banquet for the League's Eastern Regional Conference. But it was not only at the university that Clark was active in his Christian mission. He also was a ruling elder at his father's church and preached on occasion when his father was absent from the pulpit. In addition, from 1935 to 1938, Clark was a guest at least 6 times on the midweek Forum Hour with host Erling C. Olson on radio station YMCA, a program broadcast from New York City and carried on stations throughout the Northeast. On this forum, he defended Christianity on topics such as the historicity of the resurrection and is faith in the Bible reasonable? His involvement in Christianity promoting activities engrossed his life. Clark's family background and education set the stage for his involvement in the Presbyterian Church politics as an old school defender of the Westminster Confession of Faith, in a controversy then enveloping the church. However, before addressing the church issues in which Clark became involved, the next chapter will address the intellectual influences on Clark beyond his Presbyterian heritage. And that is the end of chapter 1, and I think we're trying to keep this under an hour, so I'm glad I got that done here in 51 minutes. And as I'm not doing this live, I can't ask you any questions. Maybe I need to learn more about how to YouTube properly and record things live and get questions. But if you do have questions, I will do my best to answer them in upcoming videos. I'm anticipating maybe 20 videos, maybe more. We'll see how many it takes to get through the book here. But I think this will have a great advantage to those who especially live in foreign countries where this book might be inaccessible. And I know that there are many who are interested in Dr. Clark's life and works, especially in places like Brazil. And so keep listening in here, and we'll also have this as a nice historical record. We'll keep it live there, or keep it available there on YouTube for as long as they'll let me have it. So I hope all is going well with all of you, and send me some questions to discuss in future videos. You might check ahead in the book. We'll be next time on chapter 2 on Gordon Clark's intellectual influences. We have just gone through his Presbyterian heritage, admittedly boring, perhaps, except for a few of us that like these things. But we'll look at his intellectual influences, and then we'll start really getting into the meat. And I know so many people want to know, what about Clark and Van Til? So that's the battle that's coming up later in 3 chapters. And I know recently another person has done some discussion on Clark and Van Til, and I didn't even watch it. It seems to be universally bad. The Van Tillian side is let's say a term I heard once a hiker used of the trail after a flood. He called the government criminally negligent. Well, there are scholars out there who are criminally negligent, and I hope that on this topic they'll read my book here and others, and not just become slavish followers of their theological hero, such as Cornelius Van Til. Although I must say that there are some Van Tillians who have done a good job in looking back to Presbyterian history and letting the confession and tradition of the Presbyterian Church override their views on Van Til. I recently put an article out on my blog I called The Consent of Most of the Parts. And this is sort of a play on the consent of all the parts from the Westminster Confession. And I want to leave that out there really as a challenge to those who hold to the Van Tillian paradigm, which I'm not, the enemy of Van Til. I think there's much good there. But try as I might, and asking some Van Tillians, I have not been able to get a good response as to how they can simultaneously hold to Van Til's view of paradox, along with this confessional idea of the consent of all the parts. There's the consent of all the parts is much closer to or identical to Clarke's view of things, and so do the parts consent or do they not? Is what I asked the Van Tillian, and as I note in that article, it is the confession is referring to this as an evidence to man. So no doing this twisty thing saying, oh, the consent of the parts is only in God's mind. While it is true that God can see the consent of all the parts, the Westminster Confession says it's an evidence to man. So, to the Van Tillians, is there an evidence that all of the parts consent, or do you hold that only most of the parts consent, or even that none of the parts consent? In either of those two latter options, we really have a destruction of the Scripture, as contradictions would then abound, and the lack of evidence of its divine authorship would become evident, to use the same word twice. But there's my ramblings on that. And yes, well, we'll cut it here. I hope everyone has a good day. Many blessings. God bless.